All right, you're watching the second half of the Closed Ecological Systems, or CES notes, biotic factors. We left off talking about defense against predators. We said there's chemical defenses, a skunk is a good example, and that plants also defend themselves. And sometimes those chemicals become more interesting, like hot peppers, which is from capsaicin, or poison ivy, or caffeine. And we said those are also known as allelochemicals, which are not made for the regular growth and repair and life of the plant, but they're meant just for defense. And hopefully you got on and watched the mimic octopus. It's an interesting video showing mimicry in its finest. Now, another type of defense here is this warning coloration. Some things, and the skunk's actually a pretty good example of this, display a certain pattern of coloration, although this doesn't scare you. Many other birds would think differently. And but poison dart frogs, which you may have seen in the zoo or other places, are a good example of this. It's called aposematic coloration or warning coloration. It basically tells predators stay away because otherwise you're going to get hurt. One thing to be aware of is that this requires learning on the part of the predators. There is not necessarily an instinctual behavior tied to being afraid of blue tinted frogs or of this monarch butterfly. It requires that either the organism itself, the predator itself, or that its parents had an interaction and taught their offspring. So this requires some learning on the part of the predator. And so this is a type of mimicry, which is organisms looking alike for protection. So these two snakes, for instance, the one on the right is a milk snake, not venomous, but it looks very close to the coral snake on the left. And there's many examples locally where that also occurs. Now, two different ways of mimicry can show up. One's called Batesian, by a guy whose last name happened to be Bates. And Bates found that in some cases there was one harmful organism and then one was harmless. And the safety came from the one that was harmless because it looked like the harmful one. A good example here is this bee here, this honeybee, right? If you get stung by a honeybee, you recognize that pain is a very powerful teacher, and so you then become afraid of that. This here is a bee fly. It kind of sounds like a bee, it flies like a bee, it looks like a bee. The picture doesn't really do the justice of the black and white coloration, but it looks very bee-like, and so because it appears to be like a harmful one, it gets protected. So that's called Batesian mimicry. The other one is from a guy by the name of Mueller, and Mueller found that there were other types of mimicry where both were harmful. So for instance, this honeybee and this wasp are both harmful. So the coloration here reinforces. And then these two butterflies, this is a monarch and a viceroy, these two butterflies are both also harmful or taste bad. I'll show you what that looks like in a second. You'll see, by the way, on a lot of sites that this is often referred to as Batesian because prior to maybe about 10 or 15 years ago, it was believed that the viceroy could be eaten by birds and wouldn't affect them. We'd call that palatable, and that the monarch butterfly was noxious or would make the birds sick. It's now known that although they consume different plants as they develop, they both have toxins in their body. So it's an example of Muellerian, which is a reinforcement type of mimicry. So this is an example of blue jay. This blue jay has not come into contact or learned from its parents that monarch butterflies will make it sick, and so it has caught a monarch butterfly. This is in a cage, as you can see, and it has ripped the wings off, and then it eats the butterfly body there. And then this is the blue jay shortly after throwing up essentially that body because of the toxins in there made it sick. And so you can imagine a kind of similar situation if you go to that restaurant somewhere and it makes you sick, you kind of don't want to go or eat that food anymore. And that's a similar thing here, that the bird says, I'm not going to eat anything that looks like this anymore. So that means that future monarch butterflies are all protected because of how they appear. Two other examples of mimics, both good ones. You should kind of watch these because they're very interesting. One is on digger bees or blister beetles. This is the link that'll get you there. And the other one's on a version of that has multiple different players all dealing with mimicry, mostly of smell, which is from a large blue butterfly, the video. So I'd strongly recommend you go through and watch those two videos. Either click them onto the notes or type them into your browser. Now, organisms, why do they change? When two things change as a based on one another in response to something else, we call that coevolution. And so this is when two things, based on their interactions, change over time. So for instance, white-tailed deer can jump at least 8 feet, and in some cases 12 feet high. They can long jump 30 feet. They can run 40 miles an hour. What is the purpose of that, right? It doesn't help them to avoid your, suburban or to, find food. What is the value of being able to do that? It doesn't help them in mating. There's nothing really helps them in. And so the answer that turns out is the reason they can do that is because at one point wolves in the eastern United States would have been very tough predators for them to deal with, right? Pack hunters that are highly intelligent, and the solution for them was to be able to develop skills that allowed them to run and jump away from the predators in order to survive. Now today, of course, those same skills don't really help them as they live in suburbia, but we'll look at that at another point. Now, an example of another type of interaction is called parasitism, and most parasites you're kind of familiar with, which is fleas and ticks. So I want to show you a slightly different version called a parasitoid. Rather than just living in the host or eating the host, parasitoids actually use the host to be able to feed its young. So in this case here, you see this parasitic wasp. It's actually stinging an egg into this organism right here, and then what happens is the egg develops into a larva, and then the larva essentially eats the host from the inside out. This is an aphid here, which is a small bug that eats plants, and this is the larva of a parasitic wasp coming out. So the aphid is then the meal. This is a tomato hornworm. You might see these in your garden, at home if you have one. All of these things here are pupa. If you remember, we talked about complete metamorphosis of insects, where it goes from egg, larva, pupa. These are all pupa that are of a parasitic wasp that'll all escape from there. And so part of it, the interesting part of this one, is that the virus, the wasp that stings this this tomato hornworm, which is the green guy here, they actually put in there when they sting in there, there's a virus, and that virus gets into the DNA of the hornworm and actually shuts down its immune system. Normally, if you got stung and had something in your body would react like the hornworm does, would react through an immune response to that thing and then attack and kill it. In this case, the parasitic wasp and the virus actually work together to be able to shut down it. So the virus gets kind of a free ride along here, and at the same time the wasp gets its offspring to be able to not be attacked by the immune system of the hornworm. Now, a great example here of a parasitoid is in cockroaches. It's a great video you should watch because it's kind of crazy. I've actually seen a parasitic wasp dragging a giant grass spider or wolf spider back to its den one time. So make sure you click on this one and watch that. The kind of results, if you watched it, by the way, there's one toxin with two different results. The toxin contains a chemical called GABA, which you may have heard if you have taken AP Psych or psychology classes. It actually shuts down neuron activity, and then a second sting, they actually enter the brain, which is not actually a brain in the cockroach. It's more like just a set of nerves called a ganglia, and essentially turns the cockroach into a zombie for its offspring. So if you get a chance, click on that one and watch it. Now, another version of two things living together in close association is called commensalism. Commensalism is where one is benefited and the other one is largely just unaffected. So this thing right here at the top is a lichen, and lichens often grow on the sides of trees. A lichen doesn't really affect the tree's growth because it's on the bark, it's on the side, usually grows in the shade anyway. So the tree's getting plenty of light and is unaffected by it. Another example here is, you might have heard of Nemo and the coral it lives in. So the clownfish gets the benefit of living in the coral and being protected at the same time. Possibly the coral gets no benefit from the clownfish. A little closer to home example is these guys here. This is the development of them over stages, and this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Looks like maybe 6 of them hiding in a hair follicle. This thing coming out of here is a hair follicle, and this thing here is your face. And pretty much 100% of humans have follicle mites that crawl around. They actually eat dead skin and drink a little bit of your sweat and oil, but they don't really harm you in any way. They don't transmit disease as far as we know. So they love you. You're a great home for them. You're warm, you're safe, you're clean, and for you're largely unaffected by them, but unfortunately you have them. So hopefully your face is not too itchy. They're basically in the spots around your nose and up in your eyebrows, hanging out and having a good life. Here's a video of the face mites if you wanted to see more of that and see what's crawling around on your face. Now, mutualism, a good example of mutualism, going back to, once again, the lichen, but not the tree this time, just the lichen itself, is actually a fungus and an algae that live together. So the algae is the green part, and it grabs sunlight and carbon dioxide and produces sugars. And the sugars are then given to the fungus, and the fungus's job is to basically send in little holders to grab onto the tree and hold on tightly to the tree. So they work together in a way that they both benefit. One produces the food, the other one produces the stability, and through that they survive. There's also different types of bacteria and fungi that work together with plants, and the plant on the right here is being grown with those special root bacteria and root fungi that allow it to grow bigger and stronger faster. And then a local example is that you have it's called a human microbiome, which is your normal bacteria that grow on and in you. And normally we think that we want to try and kill bacteria, that antibiotics would make you healthier, or that hand sanitizer will help you out. If you just get rid of the bacteria, you'd be fine. But it turns out that that's completely not true, that without the normal bacteria flora, you would actually be way sicker, and you actually would not survive or have developed like you have. So you have about 37 trillion human cells in your body. You're outnumbered depending on where you are, but overall about 3 to 1 by bacteria, fungi, etc. In some parts of your gut, you're outnumbered 10 to 1. So the idea is, why do you have all these bacteria? Why are you carrying around bacteria with your body? It seems like we think of bacteria as being a negative, but it turns out the vast majority of bacteria, 99.9% of bacteria, are beneficial or harmless, and only a very small fraction are harmful. So the human microbiome, you have about 3 pounds of bacteria living on you that are not actually you, which is about the same mass of the brain. So you can think of the brain and your gut bacteria or your other bacteria living in your body as about the same value. So these bacteria we've known since for decades now that they help digest your food. They provide nutrients like vitamin B and vitamin K. They protect against harmful bacteria. That's sort of kind of old news. But they also have now been found to control and influence food choices. So when you're having that craving for ice cream, it might not be your brain or your stomach telling you that. It might actually be your gut bacteria saying, hey, we're looking for a certain food source here. They are also involved in training and developing your immune system. So if you're not getting sick, it could be based on your gut bacteria keeping you alive. They affect your metabolism, which is your rate of chemical reactions in your body. They also affect some cancer rates and whether or not cancer spreads. So it turns out the human microbiome is a really rapidly growing field of science. This is a mutualistic relationship between you and the bacteria in your gut. And your job essentially for them is to feed them, and their job is to help you out and make sure that you are as healthy for as long as can be. With that, that is the end of the CES Biotic Notes Part 2, and I'm going to shut it down here. Oh, sorry, one more thing is the symbiotic relationships. This is the chart that we looked at the beginning. So I'm going to click through. So parasitism, we said one organism benefits, that's shown by a plus sign, and the second organism is harmed by it, which is shown by a minus sign there. The key terms there are parasite and host. Mutualism, if you went back up and looked at your choices, hopefully you said plus and plus, where they both benefit as a result of that relationship. Commensalism, one benefits and one NA, right? Not affected, doesn't really matter to it, no big deal. And the last one's competition. This is the one that is sort of counterintuitive. We normally think of competition as a good thing between two things, right? If Chick-fil-A and McDonald's are both competing for your dollars of buying food, then the costs go down and maybe the quality goes up. But it turns out competition in ecology works a little bit differently. That in this case, both organisms are harmed because they're always having to fight extra hard as a result, and therefore don't do as well. So. The two key terms we talked about is interspecific, which is between two different species, and intraspecific, between the same species. In either case, both species are harmed, or both organisms are harmed by that because they're both losing resources to the other in some level. So that's the end of part 2.